And thanks so much for staying with us. We're running a little late, but the conversation was so amazing that I think it was definitely well worth it. I know that the audience didn't have a chance to ask so many questions, so we will focus on your questions for this panel. So I'm really excited to be hosting this conversation today, and the goal of this panel is to explore and speculate on the ways in which the pandemic has reconfigured the notion of sustainability, that notion that was bandied about for a while. And now by putting justice, questions of justice and demands for justice at its very center. And so we will have three panelists speaking with us about this question. First, architects and curators from the Shanghai Biennale are joining us. Andrés, Jaque, who is the artistic director, and Marina, Otero, who is part of the curatorial team, will be joining us. They'll be speaking first. Adam Khalil, an artist, will be joining us second, and he is best known for his work with the New Red Order. That's been presented in several biennials. And we will be closing with Denise Ferreira da Silva, who's the director and professor at the School of Social Justice Institute at UBC in Vancouver. And she has contributed to publications for several biennials, including Liverpool, Sao Paulo, Venice, Documenta, and Toronto. The structure of the panel will be very much the same as the previous session. I will repeat it just in case people are joining us. We'll each be speaking for 10 minutes. As presenters are speaking, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A section. Don't use the comment, we won't be checking those, so just communicate with us through the Q&A. This session is being recorded, so that means that your questions and comments are being recorded, so just want to make sure that you know that. Following the 10-minute presentations, we will open up to questions from the floor. So please feed us questions all the way through. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Andrés and Marina.
Thank you very much, Sylvie and Basak. I'm very happy to be here with Marina, of course, Denise and Adam, discussing or part of this very, very important and needed discussion. And I would like to share my screen. So Marina and I, together with Lucia Pietrogiusti, Filipa Ramos, Yumi, have been working on the Shanghai Biennale Bodies of Water, a biennale that has been very directly connected to the discussion of the pandemic, and of course, severely affected by it, like all the biennales, in many different ways. First, I think the purpose of and the focus of the Biennale is very much part of the way the world is sort of exhausting a number of kind of inhabiting a number of cracks of systems of hegemony that come from economy to societal to the notions of the societal, to environmental crisis, to the effects and inequalities brought by advanced capitalism, to the cracks of the colonial system, to the tensions in the lack of accountability of technology, to a number of basically systems of dominance that had end to a point of crack and that in which we are, and that are manifesting both as a cultural question, as a political question, but also as a need to even reconsider the practicality of biennales in many different ways. We decided to the biennale already started. We felt that the biennale should occupy the calendar, in particular in a moment in which, or with a focus that was very much reflecting on the forms of embodied connectivity and embodied solidarity something like the pandemic was really at the center of what we were discussing. And we thought that it was important to keep the calendar, but not in the same way. And we proposed to do what we call, this is the curatorial team that I already mentioned, but we thought that the Biennale should be something that could become a much longer process, an 8-month process that could be evolving, reacting to the evolution of the world, introducing the voice of artists together with others as a force also that could intervene this, the way a pandemic could be dealt with. And that was something that related very much to the previous discussion, the need to respond to binarisms, to technocracia, to the power of basically control and centralized systems to deal with the pandemic, and something that we said could be explained as an inverted biennale, in which biennial, in which basically we could convene contributors, the city of Shanghai at large, affected communities affected by the topics that we are discussing, and even art students, producers, advocators, to initiate the process of co-sensing, co-responding, and also co-engaging, that would be initiated in November with what we call a wet run rehearsal, and that would expand during this 8-month period in something that would progressively galvanize as a number of works that could be seen as engaging with publics at the same time that were being happening and made possible and developed. And that is something that we explain as an increscendo biennale that could start with very, let's say, undetermined and open-ended discussions and collaborations and process of sensing, and that would probably have a moment of more concreteness or more stronger capacity to intervene reality throughout this process. The call in this first moment, this wet run rehearsal, was a call for a planetary realliance, and something that was called to reflect on very simple daily actions that connect humans to other humans, bodies to other bodies, bodies with environments, with technological systems, with ecosystems, with the ocean at large, like breathing, bleeding, clogging, decanting, decomposing, diluting, discharging, dissipating, dripping, ebbing, exuding, fecundating, filling, flooding, flashing, hydrating, infecting, infiltrating, injecting, leaking, menstruating, oozing, outflowing, peeing, pumping, permeating, sponging, sipping, soaking, straining, sweating, stagnating, swamping, transfusing. We were using these words, and we were collaborating with philosopher Aristide Neymanis as a way to think of the way embodied solidarities were actually challenging notions of state, of border division, and actually were introducing other conflicts, other divides, other issues that we need to stay with, and we stay with those troubles, and to reconstruct probably the forms of wet togetherness that our societies are possible now. And this idea of the wet togetherness was actually something that was initiating the run of this increscendo biennale, this inverted biennale, that was this moment. And this is a reflection also of how we worked, because a big part of the artists and contributors and activists and advocates and publics of the biennale are also in the distance and operating remote or hybrid. And the first moment of this convening of the biennale was this performance by artist Itziar Karitz from Bilbao that was doing this planetary and oceanic breathing, a 20-minute long breathing, where people that were in Shanghai, in the PSA, Itziar being in Bilbao, us as curators being around the world, Astida Neimanis being Australia, artists in Shanghai, in Beijing, along the Yangtze River, around the world, could be sensing in a very physical way the fact that we're crossed by air, and that air is actually something that is being fragmented, parceled, secured, controlled, centralized in the times of the pandemic. And what can we sense together out of this problematic relationship with these commons, these air commons? The flow and flash of water sustains our own bodies, but also connect them to other bodies, to other worlds beyond our human selves. In a way, it's also a call for other ontologies that we could activate, but that are, and that the Biennale could mobilize and somehow put in, think of ways of their potential for reassemblage, for collective reassemblage, but something that is very much already happening in Shanghai. One of, I think, Marina, Lucia, Filipa, me, and myself have been working on is really thinking of Shanghai and the Yangtze River and its connection to the ocean, not just as a venue for the Biennale, but really as a huge contributor, an actor of the Biennale, and to think of cells and bodies with other bodies connected with pipes, pipes connected with organisms, with ecosystems, with systems of control and domain, and at the end with the PSA itself, as the need to really rethink trans-species alliances is been very important, and the way that we could really rethink the way that we're interconnected, interdependent, entangled. It's been at the center, but also it's at the center of the Biennale, at the works that we're doing, or where the discussions that are happening, the new productions, but also it's the conflict probably of the PSA, the museum that is hosting the Biennale and promotes the Biennale, that is, it's part of the history of the Yangtze River, that is originated in the Tibetan plateau, the melting of the glaciers that is prompted by industrialization, that is dragging millions of tons of sediments to the delta, the Yangtze River Delta, where Shanghai was originated, and where the entire mobilization of bodies, resources, cold, and the exploitation of all these presences allowed for an accumulation of capital and power in Shanghai that is also the origin of this Biennale. Somehow this is not the venue, but it's the reality that it's also part of this Biennale. And in a very direct way, we feel that the very building of the Biennale, the venue where it is, this coal electric plant that was fundamental for the development of the industrial belt in Shanghai, in the Yangpuban, and that also transformed the body's patterns, control menstruation, control the weight and the ingestion, the peeing, the way animals' life could be exploited as a source of food. All this entire mobilization, the building is not neutral in it, and it's still very directly connected to its physicality. So this is also the way that we are working with this materially, disentangling and finding ways to rethink together this realliance to this process of a long increscendo Biennale.
Thank you so much, Andrés. This is exactly on time. Yeah, shall we continue?
Woo! Should I let it rip? Yeah, really amazing to be part of this, and thanks so much for having me, and amazing to be in dialogue with you all. I'll introduce myself. Ani Bojo, Shingwa Kandishnakas, Bawating and Donjiba. My name is Adam Khalil. I'm an artist and filmmaker. originally from Bawating, or what's known as Northern Michigan, a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, and one of the core contributors to the public secret society New Red Order. Bit of context, my practice is collaborative. It involves many different configurations with many different people and kind of on a shifting basis. But along with my brother, Zach, and our other collaborator, Jackson Paulus, were the core contributors of New Red Order. Was kind of thinking about angling this in terms of talking about how in vogue concepts of indigeneity and decolonization are these days within contemporary art, and then also trying to tease out parallels between the performance of an indigenous identity with the foundation of visual anthropology and also the history of biennials. So it's also from Thomas Edison's first camera test of the Sioux ghost dance to the tradition of World's Fairs and their impulse to display the spoils and subjects of colonial conquest. Indigenous people have always been in the center of the frame of cultural and visual spectacle. And as Indigenous artists who participate in the art world of settler colonial states, we are expected to provide knowledge in a relationship similar to that between informant and anthropologist. In our current period of existential and environmental catastrophe, desires for Indigenous epistemologies increase, and enterprising settlers labor to extract this understanding as a natural resource. From an Indigenous perspective, this has palpable consequences, from romanticization and commodification to appropriation and cultural erasure. Kind of within the entangled emergence of multiculturalism, neoliberalism, decolonialism, and self-reflexive anthropology, cultural apprehensions which arise from fears of offense imbricate and fuel stronger calls for Indigenous information and informants. Many non-Indigenous people find ways to frame themselves as Indigenous, just as Indigenous people perform indigeneity themselves. If these tendencies are so deeply entrenched to be apparently inescapable, can they instead be studied, manipulated, or employed by Indigenous people to catalyze an expansion of Indigenous agency, amplifying the power of the informant? Can desires that push Indigenous people to an ideal and irretrievable past instead be channeled to promote the imagining of Indigenous futures? And this kind of sets up my pitch for the New Red Order, which is a public secret society that everyone and anyone is welcome to join. Public secret riffing on Mick Tausig's idea of these things that kind of shape our worlds that we never really discuss. And being based in North America, one of those things is the reality of settler colonialism. And then also the kind of history of playing Indian in North America, like the Boston Tea Party, which is this kind of foundational event in American history of the founding of that country, involved a lot of colonists dressing up as Mohawk Indians to throw over the tea in protest. And then this group called the Improved Order of the Red Men, and then eventually the Degrees of Pocahontas, emerged as these actual secret societies, which included former presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Warren Harding and FDR. So kind of teasing this lineage of this inappropriate desire towards indigeneity, but instead of trying to stop that inappropriate desire, hopefully trying to retool it towards Indigenous purposes and futures. But so yeah, if anyone's intrigued, you could call our hotline 1-888-NEW-RED-1, or go to newredorder.org and join the New Red Order. And maybe I'll just play a brief intro video to whet everyone's beak about what that's all about. Cool. I'm a little nervous, sorry. Okay.
Start really living. Experience clarity. Act with confidence. Attract abundance. Be a part of the solution. Leave behind a better world. Never settle. On some level, we all want to feel this way, but sometimes in our globalized, capitalist, settler colonial society, it feels impossible. Which is why the New Red Order is developing a dynamic system to help our accomplices achieve all this and more. This free introductory video, The New Red Order, Never Settle, will tell you what you need to know to take control of your life today.
It's a story of support, It's a story of mentoring.
It's a story of collective liberation.
We are encouraging each other,
motivating each other,
so that we can be stronger together through knowledge.
The New Red Order, or NRO, is a public secret society dedicated to expanding indigenous agency and achieving decolonization, which brings about the repatriation of indigenous land and life.
But what does that have to do with me or you? Are you a settler? Am I a settler?
This is making me feel bad. Does it make you feel bad?
What is settler colonialism?
Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that, instead of leaving, stayed. One of the largest obstructions to indigenous growth is an excessive, some might say inappropriate, desire towards indigeneity. This desire pervades the myths, dreams, and political foundations of the so-called Americas. But how does this desire manifest? Romanticization. Appropriation. Commodification. Cultural. Erasure. Can these desires, despite their danger, be harnessed, converted, channeled to promote indigenous futures? You can have a place. Never settle. There are many roles for settler colonists at the New Red Order. We always need financial, material, intellectual, legal, illegal, and extra-legal support to achieve collective liberation. Join us today to create a better tomorrow today. Because we can't know where we're going unless we know where we've been, and we won't know where we've been unless we look to the past for the future, because the future is starting to feel a lot like the present, and we all know you'd do anything to escape that.
So yeah, again, if anyone's interested, 188-NEW-RED-1, you can call in, or newredorder.org. There's obviously a little bit of cheekiness in the proposal, but part of it is also to try to develop reciprocal relationships where indigenous artists aren't asked to necessarily perform their authenticity or to inform on their own communities, but to actually start off with curators of biennials or other arts organizations and say, what is your interest or what are your desires towards indigeneity as a kind of a starting point to hopefully move past those obstructions for actual indigenous growth. I keep riffing, but am I doing okay on time? Yeah, just a couple other practical things as an artist, because it's very rare to have this opportunity to speak to this kind of crowd. And just thinking about sustainability for artists, and it's a little mundane and practical, but some shifts I've seen with like US grant organizations and art institutions is shifting towards like a more sustainable and long-term relationship with artists. So I was involved with something at Performance Space where our group, the New Red Order, and 4 other artists were kind of given the operating budget for Performance Space for a year, which also included being paid a salary to kind of be more deeply invested within that institution, as opposed to like having one opportunity for one performance with one budget, to create these kind of relationships that last longer. And many times, you know, we've had budgets from biennials that are really decent, but then the fee associated with it, not so much. And then we're expected to work on it for over a year. And just thinking about the precarity of the financial reality of artists. And I guess the other thing too, because I'm hopping between this film and art world, is it's interesting with a film background, you have a pitch for a project and you go around proposing it. But a lot of times, especially with my peers, I've noticed that curators approach artists with the proposal, and then they're trying to like fit their practice into it. So thinking it might also, in terms of also that sustained or longer engagement, pursuing artists who have proposals or projects in the works that line up, as opposed to this more like assignment-based practice. I just have friends who feel like they haven't been able to do the thing they wanted to do because they're hopping from commission to commission. So just thinking about ways that that could be shifted or changed. What did the senator say? I cede the rest of my time. That's
You
the
have
line?
1 minute, less than a minute.
Yeah, I'm good, but thanks. Yeah.
Okay, sorry for being this time police.
Good.
But someone has to do it. Thank you so much. Shall we continue with Denise, please?
Okay. Thank you. That was so good, both of you. But thanks, Sylvie, for the invitation to be part of this panel. And it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Basak, Marina, Andrés, and Adam. I will be talking in this 10 minutes about, well, I think I'll talk about justice or something around that theme. Yeah, I think like much like the global pandemic that we are living now, the question or questions about justice or the question that justice raises, they cannot be framed, absorbed, adapted, or even anticipated. But then it's very difficult, if not impossible, to say anything about both the pandemic and justice on the spot without doing just that. So I think this is the beast, the nature of the beasts, of thinking and of tackling how, why, and by which means questions, that is questions about, that would address justice and the crisis. So I'm going to do it anyway, but only because I'm hoping to contribute to a reflection about biennials and their commitments, their ethical commitments to sustainability, speaking very generally. So I'll begin by commenting on how this current global crisis, the pandemic, is related to the three major crises of this century. So the one that was announced in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, which took the name of the war on terror, quote, the refugee crisis announced in 2014, 2015. And then before that, actually, there was a global economic crisis of 2007, 2008. And I think each of these crises signal a rearrangement of the state capital due. The first one, the 9/11 one, put the state self-preserving apparatus, the juridic apparatus, in gear. And this latest one is activating the protective apparatus in the biopolitical mode of the state. And obviously both crises have had a dramatic, all those crises have had a dramatic impact over the citizenry and economies of different countries. But speaking about these current crises, from what I gather looking at the Johns Hopkins University's global map of infections and death, much like it was the case in with the global economic crisis, government measures for dealing with the pandemic seem to be designed to minimize its impact on the economy, in particular its impact on larger global corporations and financial capital. At the same time, as it was the case with the emergence of the self-preserving security state after 9/11, thus far, the protecting apparatus of the security state, its biopolitical apparatus, like as we can see in the decisions and implementation, and then also the failure to decide or implement certain policies, that has negatively impacted economically dispossessed Black, Indigenous, people of color in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe. And we can anticipate that this global pandemic will do more harm, will kill more people, in more persons in the global South, in former colonies. So the point I'm trying to get across here, and I have to do it very quickly, so I can't do the kind of groundwork necessary for covering all the elements. The point is that these crises are global events. And by the way, that I'm also including, the ongoing climate change brought about by global warming. So that's one, because this one, there is no date for that one. But anyway, as global events, those are political events. And by that, I mean that in order to make sense of them and to consider how to respond, to think about them, we need to attend to how economic, juridic, and symbolic aspects of them operate in tandem. So in particular, as global events, what I find in this crisis is how raciality is the operative political symbolic tool, the one which explicitly, but mostly implicitly guides the justifications for decisions, proposals, and policies. And for this reason, it is more than relevant for making sense of the juridic, economic, and ethical rearrangements that this crisis seem to call for, facilitate. Anyway, so what I would like to propose for reflection is that if we are to respond to them, to this crisis, to the juridic economic reconfigurations provoked by how governments choose to respond to them, whether in terms, and if that response will be rebuilding our critical apparatus or designing artistic interventions, in which I include curation, we need to have a better grasp of how the racial works in the moment of justification, the given, which are the given reasons for decisions and also failure to decide. So listen to this quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres from 23 April 2020. It's from a statement that's titled, "We are all in this together." And I quote, "We have seen how this virus does not discriminate, but its impacts do, exposing deep weaknesses in the delivery of public services and structural inequalities that impede access to them. We must make sure they are properly addressed in the response. We see the disproportionate effects on certain communities, the rise of hate speech, the targeting of vulnerable groups, and the risks of heavy-handed security responses undermining the health response. Against the background of rising ethno-nationalism, populism, authoritarianism, and the pushback against human rights in some countries, this crisis can provide a pretext to adopt repressive measures for purposes unrelated to the pandemic." End quote. Well, what else can be said? It seems that it's saying everything, but I don't think it is not. I mean, I think it's not so much about what's said, but about the premises, the basis of the proposition. To me, what we have to look at is to the overall epistemological and ethical grounds that effectively mobilize racial difference, even if it is not named, to explain away a constitutive and not incidental dimension of the crisis addressed. Guterres' statement is a case in point. It hits all the right notes, but it implicitly retains the assumption that the figure of the human provides ethical support against this reemergence of fascism and also ordinary everyday racial subjugation, which have so much to do with how people of color and indigenous people are being most affected by this pandemic. But my point is that for almost 100 years now, sociologists have demonstrated, and in doing so established, the correspondence between socioeconomic circumstances and colonial and racial subjugation. However, this correspondence in their framework, it's explained away as individual and or institutional practices of discrimination and exclusion, which are said to violate the ruling principles of ethical principles of liberty and equality, and also the foremost ethical figure of the post-enlightenment, which is humanity. For this reason, and I know that was very quick, but we can elaborate more as we converse. For this reason, I find that what we need, and we have needed for a long time, are the descriptors of the global political architecture that take seriously humanity's constitutive violence, which is obtained, which is realized when one attends to coloniality as a mode of governance, a juridic apparatus marked by total violence, and raciality as the post-enlightenment symbolic tool that refigures coloniality. For about 500 years, those living elsewhere in the planet have not been strangers to the global north, thanks to commercial capital and its need for commodities, land, labor. For almost 200 years, humanity and raciality have cohabited in the post-enlightenment ethical text. What raciality adds to this text is an explanation for racial subjugation that constructs it as an effect of non-Europeans' distinct God-given physical traits, which are then interpreted as corresponding to different lacking or unbecoming mental, intellectual, and moral attributes. By doing so, that explanation has preempted any consideration of how, in the global context inaugurated by conquest, settler colonialism, and other modalities of colonialism, relationships mediated by extraction, these relationships mediated by extraction and expropriation, which are governed by the logic of obliteration. These relationships are represented in their sociological and I think as well in anthropological constructions as impossible, precisely because this social scientific justification for expropriation of land and labor is predicated on the necessary, because determined by the laws of nature, disappearance of the others of Europe. So perhaps briefly put, the tools of raciality and the mechanisms of coloniality now operate, so that's my overall argument, obviously, now operate through for state global capital. They are operative in the symbolic apparatus, as well as in the juridic economic infrastructure and the ethical program onto which this crisis through which we make sense of this crisis, the war on terror, the global economic crisis, the refugee crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and global warming. So let me just finish with a brief comment on the ethical implications, which are relevant to any question, any reflection on justice. Whatever concept is chosen to guide the needed ethical move as we address this crisis, whether it's hospitality, and I mentioned that because it's been prevalent in this circle, or another that shared with it the capacity, that shares with it the capacity to acquire the force of necessity. And if this principle must be sustained by the notion of duty, by a sense of obligation and not choice, as Derrida, for instance, seemed to believe, then it should not refer to some kind of transcendental realm. The crisis that will define global existence in the years to come, global warming and the COVID pandemic, require a distinct and imminent starting point. They require an image of political existence that both acknowledges the total violence authorized by old and current deployments of raciality and of colonial strategy of governance, and supports demands one that supports demands for decolonization, that is for the restoration of what has been extracted and expropriated. And thank you. I think that was
perfect. Yeah, perfect. Well, Denise, Adam, Andrés, and Marina, I would like to thank you all for generously sharing your ideas, works, and secret societies with us. It was such an insightful combination. I'm very glad. During yesterday's session, among many very substantial remarks, one stood out for me, which resonates with your presentations today. It was a remark by Jonathan Habib Enquist. He called our attention to artists as the priority throughout this crisis. Now, I would like to extend this call to the independent and even dependent cultural workers. I mean, from independent writers to choreographers, from producers to independent curators, all of whom are living and producing in precarious situations. Indeed, both artists and cultural workers are the content, are the core content and content producers of the biennials. By moving beyond any institutional critique, for me, it's a mindset to start with. So in this respect, my immediate question would be about the position of the artists. So I would like to ask you all, starting from Denise maybe, to reflect on the position and compulsions of representation of artists at this very moment. And of course, by taking socio-political and economic impacts of the pandemic on one side, and the digitalization process that has been going on out of its context, along with the tiredness of the forms that raise issues of injustice, exclusion, and inequality on the other. So Denise, can we start with you? Yeah.
Yes, it's good. I think it's a good way of beginning to address the question, because on the one hand, it is crucial that we consider and think about how to, develop and create conditions for that artists continue to do their work. And I'm thinking here particularly about the situation in Brazil, in which artists, and mostly Black artists, LGBTQ plus I plus artists, and indigenous artists have been very much affected by the Jair Bolsonaro genocidal government that's beyond security state. And obviously with the pandemic, the situation has become even worse. Now, there are the economic needs, and there are different ways of the economic needs that are already connected to different the adjective escapes me, but because I don't want to say levels of precarity or conditions of precarity, maybe that it is on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there is also maybe the critical ethical aspect of it, which might the critical aspect of the impulse, I should say, that might go to these very artists in a way that may address these artists in a way that, in combination with precarity and also with what I mentioned initially, which is how difficult it is to think through the complexities of the transformations we are going through on the spot, that may operate, the coming together of a curatorial project and precarity may operate and the quickness, how quick it has to happen, may operate in such a way as reimpose certain constraints on the artist, which has to do with different reasons, right? Or maybe because because one cannot, sorry, I'm still waking up, because one cannot, doesn't have the time to follow the critique and then come up with a project that it is actually, that does not go too quickly to what is expected and saleable and understood. And yeah, I think that's what I'd like to say. But then on the other hand, something else that becomes possible are different ways through which one can work with artists in their position of precarity, but in a way that is that facilitates, that allows for the development of works that they are interested in, rather than something that comes from somebody else's curatorial project. I think that's the demand now. And I'll use this platform to say that I'm part of a collective which is trying to do precisely that with Black and Indigenous and LGBTQI plus Brazilian artists, just creating the space for work to be shown online. But anyway, I'll stop here and go back to it maybe later.
Marina, would you like to comment on it?
Yes, yes, thank you. I will say that the questions around precarity are perhaps even more evident in biennials than in general practice connected to institutions. So because of the particular nature and temporality of these spaces, as Adam was very well explaining, many times artists and curators as well has to work with very tight deadlines and small budgets under the premise that you have a lot of exposure. So I generally find myself willing to have a long-term commitment, and that's many times is not possible because of the very nature of this type of art festivals and temporary institutions. In the case of Shanghai, I think in a way, like the apparent precarity that brings the situation with the pandemic also created a delay that allow us to connect with the artists and with the project in a different way. So what in a way was a crisis also allow us to extend the process, as Andrés pointed to, and give us more time to all of us, something that was to be like something very intense and quick that was supposed to open in November. Now suddenly we gain much more space to have the type of relation with artists that we all want to have, like a form of support. Then there are a series of decisions also connected, perhaps what Adam was saying, this kind of long-term commitments. Many times biennials work around the notion of the new commission, because indeed are platforms that allow for new commissions to happen. And we have to celebrate that. But how many new commissions can an artist do in 1 year? So perhaps in this biennial, we also decided two things. One, we work a lot with existing works that are nevertheless, we offer a contribution and a support to the artists for also existing work. And the other is that, and I think it's something that Lucia also has promoted a lot through her work, in general, but also Andrés and me and Filipa, is to understanding of how even through the different works that we have as curators or professional in other spaces and our connections with other institutions, we can support that type of continuity. So some of the projects presented in the biennial will be collaborations with other institutions, will be continuations of projects that the artists have been doing, but they needed extra support, and so on. So kind of trying to have this type of engagement. And in a way, for me, when I was starting to think about biennials, I was very obsessed with this idea of legacy. Perhaps as an architect, this idea of like what lives behind the biennials, and many times what type of transformations in the public space. And now I think less in, and perhaps also talking with François Berger during my short engagement with Manifesta, about why it has to last something in so kind of materialized way. I mean, ephemerality and temporality are also very powerful. And in this sense, perhaps the legacy that we are attempting to is connected to these forms of relations and the possibility of offering people spaces and support to develop the long-term trajectories. That's my contribution, perhaps.
Adam and Andrés, do you want to add?
Well, I think the New York Post put out something that's saying artists were the least essential workers, which was also something disheartening, but also reality. And also just among artists who are my peers, thinking of this also as a time to shift away from practice and focus on things like mutual aid or other forms of activism, which inform the project anyway, or the practice anyways, for the peers that I'm working alongside. But yeah, I think it's just been difficult too because artists need input and feedback, and everything is on Zoom calls now. And it's great to be able to connect this way, but it's also just a lot different than what we're used to. I don't want to get too rambly and all right.
Yeah, I would like to say something because there's been within all these months with the pandemic, seeing very different reactions to the calendar, and many events were deferred or canceled, and we had a very intense discussion about this because basically we started working, I think, in January, something like that. It's the first time we were in Shanghai together, and a big part of the team, and then we immediately the pandemic came, and we had a long discussion of how to deal with it, and we came to this idea that okay, this is it's very important not to avoid and prevent artists from being part of this. This is something very important. Like a pandemic, it's not only health issue. It's not only. It's a health issue. It's more than a health issue. It's a question of inequality. It's a question of sensitivity. It's a question of sensing. It's a question of aesthetics. It's a question of many things that artists deal with. And the action, the voice, the presence of artists could not be relegated. And but of course, it could be not precarized by forcing people to do things in bad conditions or to. So for us, it was very important to find a format that could allow artists to be part of this, but in their own way, with being empowered, being supported to, and time became crucial. Time was, let's invite people, let's keep the agenda running, let's find ways for people to be paid for everything that each one does, but let's do it in a way that we're not following a kind of a concept of production and achievement, but rather like really understanding that the ecosystem needs to be nurtured, needs to be taken care of, and mutually being taking care of each other. And the second thing that for me, it's the question of publics. And I also believe, I mean, it's often this news about how many people attended this venue, this event, like it's numbers that circulate. And often if we are not preventing that from happening, that becomes also a way to evaluate biennales and other events. And we were very much also discussing this, that probably our role was much more to build a collective responsibility with a very complex and fragile ecosystem of presences and contributions. And I have the feeling that the importance of universities, groups of independent association, curatorial practices that were very fragile. That is the ecosystem that the Biennale, like the one in Shanghai, could cater to rather than kind of a generic notion of public. And then we could really probably intervene that or give space for that to be happening and being taken care of a little bit, contribute a little bit, at a time that basically it was taken to a state of much more fragility and precarity than usually.
I mean, it's important that you are using publics, not the public. So public is not, I mean, our publics, they're not homogeneous. And it's another thing that we should also take into consideration. Anyway, I would like to hand it over Sylvie now. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. And for those of you in the audience, our publics, please share your questions with us. I'll have one question now, and then we will wrap up with your questions. So I guess I'd like to come back to this question of sustainability and what do we mean by that? And often I think institutions think institutionally. When they talk about sustainability, they talk about their own sustainability in a quite limited way. I think people talk about broader sustainability, but when you sort of look at the language and the actions and the focus, it's really their own. Now, there's been some really interesting shifts in the biennial world with, for example, perennial biennial, that sort of gathers 4 biennials together, and a recent development, I guess, within sort of Eastern and Central Europe that was just announced a little while ago. So moving from that sort of isolated sustainability, which is just about me, or my institution, to something that is regional. I think IBA seeks to be moving that sort of those questions on a broader scale. We need to talk about that. But as we're doing that, what I'd like to bring back to the center is we have an opportunity with every crisis. There's an opportunity, and the ones that Denise kind of mentioned before have been opportunities that many of us have lived with, and have failed. I mean, we came out of these crises, I would say, in a kind of depleted position. So right now, as we're still kind of negotiating what this kind of post-COVID world will mean, how it will work, how we will relate to each other, who determines that, how do we as biennial makers think about sustainability in a broader way, a sustainability that includes, of course, the sustainability for artists and all of us, but questions of reparation and repatriation, again, I think should be brought to the center of that discussion right now. We have that opportunity. And so how do we kind of design this world that we want to live in very purposefully and very precisely? So I'd just like to put that question out to the panelists. And again, audience members, please share your questions.
I think I can take a stab at that one, this question, and it's going to be very quick because I think the challenge, of course, repatriation is it seems to be, and it's being at least easier to bring into the conversation, right? Even though not necessarily easy to do, because of the complications, also the question of renaming of institutions, it's taking place. But what I would like to see, and I would like to hear the conversation, to follow the conversation and the works coming from the point of view of the curation, about both, on the one hand, about representation, which I think is something that Adam was touching upon, but we are all talking about that, about the need for, not going for what is immediate and, expected. And, oh God, there was something else that I would like to talk about, but went away from me. As representation and something else. I think I'll remember, but yeah, we will come out because it was something new. But anyway, that's all I'll say.
Maybe perhaps because when Denise was talking in her presentation about raciality and coloniality and the state capitalism, and obviously biennials are very much ingrained in that type of logics and the forms of circulation that are connected to these forms of fluidity and connection and movements of bodies, of capital and ideas. So for me, maybe it's a bit abstract, but in a way connects also with the former panel. What will be a form of non-Cartesian understanding of biennials that doesn't operate under these logics like Cartesian logics that very much permeate institutions and economies and the organization in the space as well of culture? And I don't have a response, but indeed it's something that we were discussing for Shanghai, and this idea of bodies of water is an attempt to think through a form of solidarity and connectivity, a form of fluidity, but it's not necessarily that the same as the capitalist regimes of fluidity. Is one that recognizes that bodies are different, but are also not sealed entities that are connected to each other. And then when we see Itziar or Karit's breathing, we cannot but also breathe together. Even there is in the breath, there is also fear for the breadth of the other. But in a way, this kind of understandings of forms of connecting and collectivity and solidarity that are otherwise. And yeah, that's perhaps what I can attempt to say. And I still don't know how that will materialize in a different system, but to me, that will be something I will look forward.
Mm-hmm.
And a sort of related question from the audience, maybe a rephrasing of the same question, which is inequality a sort of equality? So I'll just put that out to you. And the question was from Katambayi.
Well, it depends, right? If you think of inequality, if you're asking the question in terms of thinking of the everywhereness of inequality, you know, in its presence, and it's how ubiquitous it is. So in a way, yeah, it could operate. Yeah, one could think about it in this way. But I think that the issue is when we start from inequality without addressing both the more immediate aspects, as I was talking about the crisis and the state and capital, and then also without addressing what Marina was saying, which is how we even begin to think about inequality, right? Because we already begin with the dichotomies, with some distinction, with some assumptions about why some people fare better than others, which they have nothing to do with the constitutive violence that creates the inequality we are talking about. So I think that is the work is to be done. You know, we have to reflect at so many different levels and all at the same time. And I think that's why then also many of academics like me have moved closer to you, to that side of life, right? Because some of these, the thinking work cannot be done by thinking, because thinking it's Cartesian. Some of the work has to be inspired, has to come like this in the image, you know, whether the image is a whole biennial, that composition, or the image is a piece, an installation or something. It has to come this way. So yeah.
I mean, this question is really good, and also in relationship with your previous question, Sylvie, and I very much like the way Denise put it, because I think that inequality is definitely a condition of our times. It's not something that applies to individuals. It's something that affects the context and the way we connect to others. And this is something that it's very imbricated, I would say, with the organization of biennales themselves. So when we're discussing sustainability in time saved by inequality, the question of what is the kind of subjects to be sustained is crucial. And I think that this is something that the material world can help to show its failure. And I think that when we look definitely to the way biennales happen in networks of entanglement, the way art happens not as kind of individual actions, but rather part of larger ecosystems of interdependency, I think the question of sustainability becomes very, very relevant, because we see that there's an arena we're part of forms to segregate sustainability to very specific, confined, zip-up milieus. And this is crucial because somehow it also affects the very notion of subjects and how they can be mobilized in biennales. For us, somehow, we very radically saw that we could not do a biennale in Shanghai without really considering how the exploitation of people in the construction of the Three Gorges Dam was part of the transformation of the coast, the kind of riverside of Shanghai. And not being able to transform that with the tiny power of a biennale, but we can really bring other voices in, other presences being part of real time and the making of reality, the collective reality. And that's very powerful. So probably operating in the cracks that sustain these zipped up notions of sustainability is something that we can do now.
And we have another question from the audience, from Jonathan. So he's asking, it'd be interesting to hear a few words about the notion of time. For instance, seeing biennials being curated twice by the same curator, for example, the Oslo Biennial, which means that the sort of time frame is stretched to sort of 5 years. I think that's definitely part of the question, and it's sort of related, that was Jonathan's question. A related one is, again, one of time, because we're always operating in kind of two temporalities. One is the temporality of our practice, which is a sort of really long time ongoing, hard thinking, speculating around ideas. And then this other time, which is the time of the biennial, where we have to collapse all of this. So we're always kind of shifting time frames and shifting time scales and trying to translate. Yeah, maybe if you could speak to these questions.
Kind of also weaving that into the previous questions about repatriation and reparation, I think that's something that's really tricky for biennials, because that is supposed to consolidate this kind of panoramic view of what art or culture is at a moment, or some biennials attempt to do that, but also like from an indigenous perspective, with constant change in terms of like regimes or people in control, there can't really be a reciprocal relationship that's lasting or trustworthy, or like maybe like 1 year there's some kind of like effort made for some effort of repatriation, but that's not necessarily at all significant 2 years later, or it just becomes this kind of symbolic gesture. So I think maybe like also thinking about institutionally having the same people there, although that kind of counteracts the benefits of biennials, they can change. So it's like a fine line, but some kind of infrastructure to also be working with communities like in the areas outside of whoever's coming in and out of it all the time.
I agree. I think maybe this idea of longue durée biennial curation precisely might lead to be able for curators to do the work that we cannot do with such a short time. And obviously, I think raises a question of how to work in the local environment. And I think maybe we don't have to fetishize also the local, but being situated, how to work in a situated way, whether it is like with a particular discourse or area of thoughts or, you know, a struggle or a community, etc. And it's true that many times it's like the urgency to have new ideas or new topics for biennials, whereas sometimes why don't we all do the same? Because it's actually the question of the time, you know? So I'm very happy when like many biennials are approaching or institutions the same question, and is where the question of originality is not relevant, but actually the possibility of a collective way of thinking and effort to make a you know, sustainable change. So I like indeed that idea that allows for practices of care much more embedded and situated. So I will go for it. But I don't know what will be called then biennial. I don't know. Maybe it needs another name or.
Yeah, or maybe they start to think in a sort of, you know, differential time frame, so that you're already working with people for 5 years, but then there's an overlap with another team that's working on another project, and that there is some kind of sharing of information beyond the institution. And, you know, I think I mean, that's what we do. We can imagine different ways of working if there's a will and I say a desire and a mission to say, for example, that we're putting justice at the center of what we're going to do from now on, and really do it, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. But it's also so much related with the need for new infrastructures in general, and radical infrastructures.
and I would say also radical confrontation of existing infrastructures. Maybe that comes from Shanghai, where the kind of occupation of the common by what we've been discussing, as Yumi has named it as infrastructure libido, is a huge problem, and basically needs to be confronted. It needs to be challenged and give space to other forms of togetherness to emerge.
Okay, and the International Biennial Association tells me to do my job about time policing. So maybe we should say goodbye now, although it was amazing conversation. Yeah.
And join us on social media, and let's keep the conversation going there. And let's do this again soon, I would say.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was
Thank
amazing.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Basak, Sylvie, thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
An absolutely fascinating set of conversations, and really sets the tone for questions around what it would mean to create biennials around the principles or ethics of care, as well as sustainability. And in themselves, these seem intrinsic to larger questions, and here I'll use the words of Maria Teresa Alves to think about what are the various recipes of survival for biennials that ensure that their engagement and impact is more inclusive and enduring. So I think these conversations today have really begun what I hope will be deeper conversations moving forward through PASS and beyond. But on behalf of the editorial committee of PASS, I would like to give an enormous thanks to our wonderful speakers for joining us today, and for their important contributions to debates about the biennial field, as well as curatorial and artistic practices more broadly. We would also like to thank everyone who attended these conversations and put forward questions for our panelists. It's been a very meaningful way of marking the launch of PASS, and we hope the conversations will continue to expand as we add content to the site and host events such as this. We'll share our URL and social media in the comments section, and please join us on these platforms to continue the conversation and engage with the text. We also invite you to share your thoughts about the site and ideas you would like us to consider through the About section of the website or through pass@biennialassociation.org. In closing, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to the Government of Sharjah and the Sharjah Art Foundation for their support of the International Biennial Association. We also thank the Perennial Biennial and the members and supporters of IBA for making this publication and event possible. And with that, I will close the event, and thank you again to all.